Bardzo serdecznie Państwa witam.
I would like to welcome you cordially.
Tak jak Piotr powiedział,
as Piotr mentioned,
2 tygodnie po tym głosowaniu, więc
we've gathered here 2 weeks after the elections, so we have a certain perspective right now, and we can take a look at the European political scene from a perspective. Before the elections, in the run-up to the elections, there were some theses. Some people claimed that we have strong polarization and that right-wing parties will be successful. And now I'd like to ask you to summarize very briefly what is most important from your perspective when we analyze the European political scene and the societies in Europe after elections. From your perspective, what's the most important part? What trends emerged? And maybe some things that were not noticed before the elections. Maybe we should interpret what we have now in a different way, that the things are being interpreted. And I'd like to ask Susie Dennison first to take the floor. You prepared a report. What are the conclusions from the report?
Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope it's okay if I speak to you in English, because it would be very confusing if I tried to do this in Polish. I'm going to try and very briefly draw a few conclusions from the work which Piotr referred to that we've been doing at ECFR around the European Parliament elections. Basically, I have sort of 4 main conclusions looking at Europe as a whole, and then I'm very interested to hear from the other speakers about sort of how this analysis fits for them in the Polish context. And I could maybe offer a few thoughts as part of the conversation on where I see differences between Poland and Europe as a whole. So I think the first thing that really stood up from our pre-election analysis from the results is that the European electorate is very fragmented and quite volatile at the moment. I think this is very clear if we look now at the makeup of the new European Parliament, and as many commentators have noted, we're in a sort of a new historical situation in which the grand coalition of EPP and Socialists and Democrats can no longer make up a majority within that parliament because of this fragmentation. This is not necessarily a negative thing. This is just a reality of the differences in the electorate. I think the second thing that we can see is that voters are very much change-driven. And for me, this is one of the reasons why everybody characterizes themselves as a winner coming out of these elections. So you hear from the nationalist parties that they won this because in at least 5 European member states they came in first place in the European Parliament elections. You also hear from the kind of the pro-European, if you like, the progressive parties, that they won this because they held back the kind of the expected tide of nationalists in these elections. But I think that the reason everybody feels like their message got through is that both sides were sort of pushing in a way against the status quo. Both sides were asking for a different Europe that is more reactive on the issues that they care about. I think the third thing sorry, just on that change-driven point, one of the kind of the most striking findings from our pre-election survey was this idea that the majority of voters feel that the political system is broken. 3/4 in our surveys answered that either the European level or the national level of government or both were broken. And I think that kind of framing is very important to understanding this change-drivenness of the electorate right now, that where people were sort of voting against the system, that wasn't necessarily just against Europe, that was asking for politics to be different and more delivery-focused. I think the other sort of idea that comes through very strongly from looking at these elections is the sense that the European electorate is fearful about the future, is stressed about the present, and is finding that difficult, but has a resilient optimism. So I think that what this election was a kind of a message to political representatives that that the fear and the stress are vital, and they therefore want to see delivery on the issues which for them make that up, whether that be the economy, whether that be climate, whether that be the sort of the future of Europe, where we saw quite a high proportion of people thinking that it's entirely possible that the EU may collapse in the next 10 to 20 years. In our pre-election surveys, again, this was majorities in every member state except for Spain. But on the other hand, they've given the institutions a chance to, this is where the kind of the optimism comes in, that they've given the institutions a chance to deliver on these things this time around. So we're perhaps in a kind of, I don't know if you'd want to call it a test period, you know, that this opportunity has been given this time around to the institutions. And then I think the kind of the final point that I would draw out in terms of characterising the European electorate is that for the first time, I think we can start to talk about a European electorate. What has been quite interesting from watching the campaigns this time around was the extent to which even nationalist parties felt that it was worth thinking about pan-European alliances, worth coordinating on pan-European messaging, not necessarily for the same vision of the EU as sort of centrist parties would share, this idea of a Europe of common sense, a Europe of nation states that Matteo Salvini has been sort of corralling from Italy. But nevertheless, I think we've started to have kind of debates about what Europeans want that go beyond national borders. Notwithstanding, of course, that national issues remain very important in the campaigns in every setting. But I think it's clear from looking at the kind of the way that different people voted in these elections, and this is work that I'm presenting you today, that we carried out a day after survey in 6 largest European member states, and we're just going through the process at the moment of analysing these results. So in a way, I'm kind of testing our findings with you here and interested in your criticisms and reactions. That will help us sharpen our analysis before we publish next week ahead of the European Council. But it seems very much that this idea of pro-European and anti-European parties was quite important in terms of what issues drove voters. And what I mean by this framing is not necessarily integrationists versus people with sort of a status quo vision of Europe. I don't think that, as I say, that either of the European groups are pro-status quo. I think that what we see is rather people are happy and want to protect the current level of integration that we have in Europe versus those who want to see less. I think that's the kind of the way that I would split the electorate right now. And it seems that you know, there was very much a kind of split screen election between these two groups. And as a result, this is why we're getting the kind of the split screen analysis of what happened, that both sides have got a different story about what happened here. So this kind of, I think, creates a real challenge in terms of how we move forward in the institutions, because in a fragmented parliament, there is a real need to work across the different groups and find ways of delivering together. So just a sort of a few thoughts on how you might go about sort of looking at where there is common ground between those two sides. Firstly, the drivers of what people felt they were voting for in these elections were very different between pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans. I'll use those very kind of shortcut labels from now on, haven't explained what I mean by them. Firstly, for pro-Europeans, the big ideas that sort of led them towards one party or another seemed to have been nationalism, so the fear of nationalism towards the EU, as a threat to the EU, climate, and the economic crisis. Whereas for the sort of those who voted for anti-European parties, the idea of migration or Islamic radicalization seems to have been a big driver, what the parties were saying on those issues. Security, in both a kind of a national anti-terrorism sense, but also international security in a dangerous world, seems to be significant too. But interestingly, when we've asked people about whether or not they see the national or European level as being more important in combating those threats, the largest answers for both pro and anti-EU voters is that both levels are important, which I think is interesting, that we're in an environment where even the nationalist voters can see the utility of the EU on the issues that they care about. Second big idea sort of stemming out of the volatility of the electorate that I talked about at the beginning. Back in April, we estimated in a report from ECFR called What Europeans Really Want, that there were around 97 million voters who were kind of up for grabs, in the sense that they were either undecided on who to vote for or were planning to vote one way but tempted by another party. We think that probably that figure was even higher in the actual election because of this higher turnout that a lot of people have commented on. And therefore, as a result, it seems like, because of last-minute decision-making, that the campaigns, the manifesto promises, were very important in terms of what people think they've given the Parliament a mandate, and the broader institutions a mandate to do in this election. So we've been doing some more analysis, looking at what exactly were the manifestos of the different parties that won seats in these elections. And we found that on these kind of big threat areas that I've been referring to, that people felt they were voting on, there are now a majority of MEPs who stood for parties and have been elected, who have stood on platforms of defence of democracy in the EU. So there should be kind of a majority in the Parliament in favour of doing more on that, working together at a European level on climate, and working together more on security and defence, so this kind of safety, security idea. But on migration and the economy, two of the other big driver issues that I talked about, there are strong minorities in favour of doing more, but very big differences over what that more is on those areas. So you can see it's kind of, it's challenging to think about what exactly might be delivered by the Parliament. Just very quickly, as a result, if we think more about sort of issue-based coalitions that try to deliver on these questions that voters care about, you can imagine that coalitions might be quite unwieldy. But I think it is quite important to think beyond sort of mainstream coalitions of the larger centrist parties in terms of how that might be delivered. Firstly, because of numbers, because you sort of need those broader coalitions to have a majority. But secondly, because we've been testing in our day after surveys the sort of the tolerance among electorates for this idea. And among pro-European voters even, there is much more tolerance still for the idea of mainstream coalitions than working with the extremes on either side. So I think that this will be a kind of a learning period for both the electorate and political parties in a way, to start to accept that it may be necessary to work beyond the mainstream in order to deliver on some of these issue-based questions. And then very finally, just a point on geography, that I think that these elections have very much shifted the centre of gravity geographically within Europe in a number of ways. Firstly, within the political families, we've seen a slight shift within the EP towards Central and Eastern European states. ALDE in some ways has gone the other way, with a very kind of explicit French domination now under the new ALDE alliance, and that will be particularly the case after Brexit, when that finally happens, because the UK Liberal Democrat success has been quite important to that political group in these elections. Socialist and Democrat seems to have gone slightly south in terms of the domination. And the kind of the green wave that we've talked a lot about in these elections is quite German, French, and UK dominated. So I think that sort of learning to live with these new geographical realities will be important, as will the sort of the impact that has around the European Council table in terms of the shifts between the different political families in a more kind of politicized environment for doing policy, where we've seen opposition strengthened in some countries and governments weakened, but also in other countries, including some kind of anti-European ones like Italy, Hungary and so on, with big successes for the governments in power. I think that it's going to be a sort of an interesting and testing time for politicians to sort of take this mandate forward. So maybe I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo ciekawy i wyczerpujący wniosek.
Thank you
Dzień dobry,
very
oczywiście
much.
witamy
Very interesting
Michała Boniego,
conclusions.
który
Now we want to
pędził do
welcome
nas
Michał
z
Boni,
lotniska.
who was
Bardzo
rushing to
dziękujemy.
us from the
Ale ja
airport
chciałam poprosić
to join
teraz,
our debate. And
Wawrzyńca
now I would like
Smoczyńskiego
to ask
jeszcze,
Wawrzyniec
eksperta,
Smoczyński, our
analityka,
expert, our analyst,
ewentualnie o jakieś uzupełnienie
to
tego
make some
obrazu,
further
a
comments
może
as regards the
spór,
picture of the
europejskiego, ale
European
też
Parliament after
określenie
the
jakoś właśnie
elections.
tego kontekstu polskiego,
And maybe you could also
tej
refer to the
geografii,
Polish context. So
jak
with
bardzo
regard to this
Polska
geography
różni się
Susie was
od
talking
jakichś
about, so
trendów,
what is the
które
difference
widzimy
between Poland and other
w
European
dalszych częściach
trends
Europy.
that you
Na
can
przykład w
observe
tym
in
kontekście,
other
że
countries?
Tutaj Suzy Denison mówiła o fragmentaryzacji.
Susie was talking about
Mamy tutaj w Polsce
these
widoczną
political forces being
konsolidację.
fragmented now in Poland. I
właśnie.
think we have a different situation because our political parties seem to be consolidated. Hello everyone. I'd like to make two general comments first. As regards the whole European Union, I think it is a triumph of democracy. That means that the turnout is much better, not only in Poland, also in France. And France is a country with great democratic traditions. And the turnout has always, the turnout in European elections has always been lower as compared to parliament general elections. And this time it was a little bit different. And it is a triumph of democracy, which is of course something we can be happy with, but it doesn't mean that the results as regards the implementation of the politics will be good as well. Because you need to take a look at who has been able to convince the voters, and we can see that many populist movements have been very successful in this regard this time. So it is a triumph of democracy. This is of course great, but nevertheless we need to acknowledge that many populist movements have been successful in these elections. So this is my first comment. My second comment, well, it would be like, I think that the fear is much bigger now than hope. We've had a lot of hope in the history of the European integration, and right now I can see a recession as regards hope. We tend to be afraid, there is a lot of fear. We fear different things regarding the migration, regarding the identity. And we have Russian as well that is able to pose a military threat to Poland and the climate challenges. And there is also a threat as regards the economy, because many people in Europe feel that their life has not becoming better recently in economic terms, and people are kind of preparing for another economic turmoil or maybe even a crisis. So that would refer to Europe. Now, when you think about Poland, we can see these trends as well, because the turnout has been higher as well, even though the result is not what we hoped for, because it was finally the Peace Party that won the elections and not the European coalition. But still, it is a triumph of democracy, because many people who used not to vote have voted this time. And they just felt motivated to vote, and maybe it was the government of peace that motivated them to cast their vote. But we also have some radical voters. They are becoming stronger and stronger, and they feel optimistic enough to vote for the Confederation, for example. The Confederation did not make it into the parliament, but the result was very close to 5%, which is the threshold in Poland. And this result was much higher than what we had expected for this political group. I think that the campaign in Poland was driven by domestic issues. We are a country that is highly polarized, and I had this impression that many political groups were already positioning themselves with a view to the general elections. So we didn't have many European topics covered in our campaign, and that's why the Greens were not so successful, for example. because this campaign was not about European issues, it was more about domestic issues, and it was dominated by PiS and the opposition. So all those political groups that were trying to position themselves with a view to the general elections to take place in autumn. And now the result is that the opposition is not really strong after these elections, and there is a lot of fear that the European coalition would not be able to win the general elections in autumn. And PiS feels much stronger following these elections. But I think that these elections could be quite good for Grzegorz Schetyna. Why? I am not a great fan of his talent as regards the leadership, but I think that Grzegorz Schetyna was very lucky with these elections. Why? It is a defeat, but you could see this as a sort of general rehearsal before the general elections coming in autumn, and he will not be removed from the position of the leader of the opposition, of the civic platform, and of course there are also no good opponents that could become the leader within that party, but he got a lot of good advice because of this defeat. I think this could be an important lesson for him. And if they do not win the general elections in autumn, we will have like 100% proof that this idea, this concept of the European coalition is no good, it's not efficient. And PiS had a successful campaign, and PiS proved that it is able to use its powerful position, the position of being the government, and you can also see how many power instruments were used by this party, like the insurance company that is managed by the government and paid compensation for people who suffered losses because of the flooding that took place in the south of Poland. So the government even used that instrument to motivate voters to vote for them. And delivery-driven politics, well, this applies to both Europe and Poland. And I would say, well, I do not want to give you any numbers. I think it's like 50-50. You have absolutely no idea who is going to win. It could be PiS, it could be the European coalition. It's really 50-50. But it used to be 80 to 20% in favor of PiS. So this is already a great progress that has been achieved. And I think it's really something that depends on the performance of Grzegorz Schetyna, how well this politician will be able to prepare the party for the general elections. And I would not hope for Robert Biedroń to be extremely successful in the general elections. So you are saying that there is more fear than hope. Susie was also talking about this fact that Europeans fear the future, but there is also optimism. She said that there is a chance for a change. That we know that we have political groups in the European Parliament that are more that are stronger, and they focus on the future. So why do you think that there is more fear than hope? Why are you so unequivocal with your remark, unlike Susie? Well, I just think if we take a general look at the roots of populism in Europe in the recent 6 years, I think it is just because politics has become much more emotional once again. It used to be much more logical, and now it is all about emotions once again. And when we had this long period of prosperity, people did not care about emotions so much. They just focused on the logics. And right now, after we observe that political and economic turmoil, we can see that people just come back to their animal instincts, and one of those instincts is just fear. And that's why we have this wave of populism, and we all hope for this wave of populism to go down. down, but it is not going down. It is going up, and it has already arrived in the European Parliament. Susie was saying that we could be optimistic because the liberal forces have won the elections. Well, it is true. But the mainstream parties, whether they are Christian Democrats or Socialists or Greens, these parties have held the powers for so many years, and the question now would be whether they are sensitive enough to change, to adopt following these elections, to learn a lesson from these elections, or they will just keep doing what they have been doing for so many years, and they will just show to the voters that they are just self-complacent and they will keep making the same decisions under the leadership of Angela Merkel, and will once again have institutions under the leadership of old boys, what we call them in Poland. So these are men over 65, and they have held the leadership of the European institutions for so many years, and this could happen again. We have no balance with regards to sexes, for example. There is a geographical balance that is really something that is respected, but there is absolutely no balance with regards to sexes, and there is also no balance with regards to the countries of origin. So this diversity that we have in Europe is not really reflected in the leadership of the European institutions. And one more question as regards Poland. Susie was talking that the majority in the European Parliament would opt for fighting the climate change, for security, defense, and democracy. And this is something that sounds like a conflict with the Polish government. Or would you say this differently? Because these are issues in which peace would have probably differing opinions from those of the majority in the European Parliament. Well, let's face it, it is not a dispute between equals. It's not that Poland is less important, it's just a natural fact that we have a different amount of power. We do have equal rights as a member state of the European Union, but we are not as strong as Germany or France, for example. And also it is in the interest of peace to have these arguments with the European Union, because it is something that gives them votes nationally as regards domestic issues. So whatever the European Union could be doing, I think peace will always be in opposition to that, because it is in the interest of the Peace Party to be in opposition with regard to the European Union. This is something that gives them votes in Poland, and this is going to be absolutely nothing new. I don't think that the European Union is turning its back on Poland. It was Poland that turned its back on the European Union a few years ago, and I think if we have the same government in Poland after the general election, this will not change probably, but we'll see. Maybe if we do have this peace government once again, they will take a different approach. I don't know. They might take a decision to continue what they've been doing, or they might decide to have a milder approach after all.
Now I'd like to ask Eva about the situation of Greens in Poland. Why weren't Greens successful in Poland? And do you have anything to add to what the previous speakers said concerning the analysis after the elections? But mostly I'd like you to focus on the Greens. Well, first of all, I'd like to correct one thing. It's not true that the Greens did poorly in Poland. That's not right. You need to take account of the aspirations and of the situation of the Greens before the election. We need to take a perspective towards what the Greens are in Europe and what the Greens are in Poland. Well, the Greens were created in 2004 when Poland joined the European Union, and let's look back at that time. What did Poles want at that time? They wanted to be West. They wanted to belong to the West, to have the same beautiful flats and cars as the citizens in the West. They wanted to consume as much as possible. They wanted to get richer and richer, irrespective of the cost, for instance, with respect to the climate. And an average Pole did not know anything about threats to the climate. So the realities were totally different back then in 2004, where the Green Party was created. And the Green Party was created out of LGBT movements, environmentalists, and so on and so forth. And the comments in Poland were that gays and lesbians established their own party. That's how the situation was commented on in Poland back then. So we need to realize that the realities were totally different. And now we've got the Green Party with no access to the mainstream for 15 years, and still they survived. And for the very first time, it took part in elections to voivodeship councils, and it became visible for the first time ever, and it gained access to exit polls. This is the first time after 15 years that we realized that, for instance, 70% or 60% of our voters are women. We didn't have access to the data before. We got that after 15 years, and that's why when it comes to European elections, this is the first time that the situation is different. We've got 28 different voting systems across Europe, and each member state elects MEPs according to their own rules. So we need to take account of our voting system in Poland. You need to realize how many signatures you need to get to be able to register a slate of candidates. And you need to remember that we have the GDPR, data protection regulation, and it's really difficult to collect signatures, to ask people to give us their phone numbers, give surnames, and so on. Well, it's good that we have GDPR, but the voting system needs to change. Okay, so you think that the future will be better for the Greens in Poland? Yes, for the very first time ever, the name of the Greens appeared in the name of the coalition, and for the very first time ever, we had our candidate in all the constituencies, so each Pole could vote for a representative of the Green Party, and for the very first time ever, we had access to the media. People were able to listen to what Małgorzata Tracz during the conference. She talked about a positive vision, because everyone else was using the anti-peace language. So for the very first time ever, the Poles discovered the green vision. So you think that the trend is positive in Poland as well? Yes, it is positive, but there is a huge gap when it comes to the awareness of Poles and the knowledge of Poles. The awareness and knowledge of Poles are very fresh, because information provided by the media on climate change
tegorocznym, a to już jest 4. szczyt klimatyczny pod polską prezydencją.
Has been provided only after the climate summit that took place last year in Poland. So it's the very first time that there is some media coverage on climate issues in Poland. And it turns out that the opposition is starting to talk about green issues in Poland, in opposition to the ruling party, which is in favor of the mining industry. And we have Greta Thunberg, who is also very significant. This girl from Sweden makes us realize that we need to change our system, because otherwise our children and grandchildren will not have safe future in Europe. people are really shocked. Teenagers are shocked. They are depressed because of the fact that the future is so bleak. So the realities that we are in right now are totally different that they used to be in the past. And thanks to the support, thanks to Extinction Rebellion, thanks to climate strike,
młodzieżowy strajk klimatyczny. Dzięki tym ruchom
thanks to these
Zieloni nagle
movements,
stali się,
the Greens
oczywiście dzięki 180 000 głosujących
have started
wyborców
to
w
have
Sejmie do
become
Sejmików,
an important
nagle Zieloni
political
stali się
force,
partnerem.
and it's
Pożądanym
also
partnerem
thanks
takiej
to
dużej
the fact that we
mainstreamowej
took part in elections to
właśnie
voivodeship
te
councils
kwestie
in
strach
Poland.
versus
And when it
nadzieja,
comes to fear against
uważa
hope,
pani,
what
że
do
właśnie
you
w Polsce
think?
jest
Do you
też
think
potencjał
that
wystarczający
there is
nadziei,
a
albo
potential
zmiana
of
pokoleniowa
hope in
może
Poland?
nadchodzić?
Do you think that
No
generational
właśnie, że trend
change
będzie
is
inny niż dziś
coming
niepokoi
and
wielu
that
z
the
nas
trends
obserwuje,
will
czyli
be
takiej
changed?
polaryzacji,
Or do you think that
dosyć konserwatywnej,
conservative
sporu
polarization
wewnętrznego,
and the internal
który zaczyna
dispute
regulować, odpowiadać na wszystkie inne spory i tak dalej, i tak dalej. Czy widzi pani, że
will be
miejsce na to, żeby Zieloni, czy
more
ze względu
important?
na potrzeby
Do you think
wyborców,
that there
czy
is
ze
a
względu
place
na
for the
kryzys
Greens
klimatyczny mogli
on the
zejść?
Polish political
Przede
scene?
wszystkim zielona fala w
Well,
Europie
the
jest
green
ogromnie
wave
pomocna.
in Europe
Trzech
is
krajach.
really helpful.
Nie,
In three
ona jest
countries?
w
No,
całej
it's
Europie,
all
bo to
across
jest,
Europe.
Państwo widzicie tylko 3 kraje.
You can see only three countries,
Trzeba patrzeć tak.
but
jeśli
we
chodzi o
need to
procenty,
take a
to powiem
broader
tak.
perspective.
Holendrzy 11%
The Dutch,
plus 4.
11%
Irlandia
plus 4,
11,4
Irland
plus 6,5.
plus
Niemcy
6.5,
21% plus 10.
Germany
Francja
plus
13,5% plus 4,5.
France plus
Finlandia 16% plus
4.5,
7.
Finland plus
Dania
7,
13,3%
Denmark
plus 2,
plus 2,
UK 12%
United
plus
Kingdom
7,
plus 7,
Belgia
12%,
flamandzka 12,4%,
Belgium
plus 2, oni już
plus
mieli dobre.
2%.
Belgia
The
walońska
situation
20% plus
was
8,
good
Luksemburg
there already.
19%
Luxembourg
plus 4,
19% plus
Szwecja
4,
11,5%,
Sweden
minus 4,
11.5%,
ale
which is
oni
minus
bardzo
4,
mocno stracili w
but
ostatnich
they
wyborach
lost lots of
parlamentarnych i teraz
seats
zrobili
during
plus
the last
4,5%
parliamentary
wobec
elections,
parlamentarnych.
and their
Oni są
result
już od dwóch
is
kadencji.
better
Czyli ta zielona fala
by
to nie jest tylko, my tylko
4.5%
widzimy
than the
te,
result they
najwyższe
achieved
słupki.
during
Ona jest
parliamentary
wszędzie.
elections. So
I
the wave
ten
is
trend
present
widać.
not only
To, że
in
zieloni,
the three states
ale
that you
te wyniki
mentioned,
byłyby
it's
inne,
present
gdyby była
all
jedna
over
ordynacja
Europe,
wyborcza w całej
and
Europie, ta sama. To
the
te
results would
wyniki
be
byłyby
even
zupełnie
better
inne.
if
Ale
we
przy
had
tych różnicach ordynacji
single
po prostu
voting
one są
system
takie,
all
jakie w
across
danym
Europe.
kraju, jaka
But
jest
we need
ordynacja,
to
jakie
take
są
account
możliwości
of the fact that we've got 28 different voting systems. In Germany,
no,
they have
21%,
21% and
Walończycy
they
mają
have
przy
21
20%
seats.
dwóch
And
europosłów. Także to jest po prostu,
for instance,
trzeba
in
to widzieć,
Belgium,
jak się to
we've got
przekłada. To się nie
20%
przekłada
and
jeden do
it's
jednego.
28
Więc
seats.
ta zielona fala jest wszędzie,
just two
jest
seats,
oczywiście
so
w Europie Wschodniej i
the
Południowej
numbers
jej nie ma,
do
dlatego,
not
bo
translate in the
świadomość
same
ludzi
way
jest inna i
into
na
the
razie
number of
jesteśmy na
seats.
innym
And we need to
etapie. Ta
realize
wiedza,
that the stage we are
którą
in
mają
in
ja
Poland
jak
is
przyjechałam z
different
Francji 7
than
lat
the
temu, to we
stage
Francji po
of
prostu
the
czteroletnie
awareness
dziecko
and
miało
knowledge
zaaktywować do
in
człowieka
Western
robi,
countries. For
że
instance,
to
in France,
gazy
even a
cieplarniane,
4-year-old
prawda? I że efekt
child
szklarny.
is aware
A u nas
of the
minister tego
greenhouse
nie wiedział.
effect.
Więc w
And
związku
in
z tym
Poland,
jesteśmy na
some
tym
time
etapie.
ago,
Jest
even
świadomość,
ministers were not aware
wiedza
of
ogólna
such
ludzi
problems.
jest
So
na
the
dużo
general
niższym poziomie,
knowledge and
a
awareness of
jednocześnie
people is
dopiero
much
teraz
lower
odbyły
in
się
Poland
te
than in
transfery
Western
socjalne, bo
countries,
myśmy o
and
tym nie mówili do
social
tej pory, o
transfers
zwycięstwie
have been
PiS.
taking
Ale PiS przede
place
wszystkim
in
dokonał ogromnych
Poland.
transferów socjalnych, które oczywiście
Thanks
są
to the Law and
precyzyjnie
Justice
kierowane
Party,
na ich
and
własnych
they are
wyborców.
directed
Te transfery,
very
ale te transfery
precisely at their
socjalne ludzie się
own
do tego przyzwyczają
voters,
i będziemy
and
mogli
people
wejść na
will get
wyższy poziom
used to those
świadomości.
social transfers, and
Tak, bo
this
to
will
jest rzeczywiście
convert
kwestia też,
into higher level of
kondycji
awareness.
gospodarczej
Yes, and that's
I
also
jeszcze
an
jest
issue
jeden
of economic
element, o którym nie mówiliśmy,
situation. And there's one more
autorytaryzm i
thing that we
przejmowanie
did not
państwa.
mention:
To jest, czyli myśmy to widzieli w
authoritarian
kampanii wyborczej. Ja
attitudes
startowałam w
and
Małopolsce
taking
i
over
Świętokrzyskie w okręgu. Byłam
the
kandydatką
state.
Zielonej.
I was.
Wieszam ludzie
I
wieszają
took part in the election in one of constituencies in Poland,
w niedużej miejscowości i rano
in a
jest
small
napis na tym,
town,
ta rodzina to są zdrajcy
and
narodowi. Ludzie się po
on the
prostu boją.
posters showing my face and the
W
face
Zakopanem
of
na banerku Róży Tun rano jest oblane
Róża Tun,
gnojówką, a jej wolontariusze w Kielcach dostają kubeł gnoju na głowę
wrote
w
there,
środku
you
dnia
are
na głównym
traitors,
placu.
and people
Więc
do lots of
chodzi o to,
horrible
że
things to
doprowadziliśmy
our
przez 4 lat
posters,
propagandy
which shows
nienawiści,
that
pogardy i wyśmiewania.
the years of
doprowadziliśmy do
hate
takiego
propaganda
stanu,
led to a
że,
situation
jest tak wielka polaryzacja i
where
tak
the
wielka
polarization
nienawiść. W związku
and
z tym,
hatred
mając media,
are really,
mając media,
really
można wszystko
significant.
zrobić, czyli
Media are
ten-
able to
Zaczęła
do
Pani, bo tę
anything.
dyskusję
Okay, let me
prowadzimy,
stop
będziemy dalej
here.
jeszcze prowadzić.
We'll
A chciałabym jeszcze wrócić
continue
do tych
with
spraw
our
europejskich
discussion,
i do
but let us
Michała
get
Boniego
back
się,
to the European
zwrócić.
affairs, and I'd like to turn
jak
to
pan
Michał
i pana
Boni now.
partia odnoszą się,
What's your
zdaniem wielu
approach
niezbyt
to
się
the results
odnoszą,
of
do tych kwestii,
your
które między
party
innymi
and in
potwierdza
general to the
badanie,
results of the
ECFR-u,
European
która Suzy
elections
Denison,
and
że
the
ludzie,
reports by ECFR
bardzo
that
często
Suzy
duża część
Denison
ludzi
talked
głosowała
about
z
show
potrzeby
that lots
zmiany,
of people
że są to
voted
głosy
because they
też
wanted
często
Europe
pełne
to
nadziei, czy
change.
już
Do
frustracji,
you think
ale jednak w jakimś sensie przeciwko systemowi politycznemu,
and
którego oczywiście w
the
Polsce
previous
Platforma
speaker said
Obywatelska
that
jest
people were
emanacją.
voting
Była
against
mowa
the status quo, and Wawrzyniec Smoczyński talked about generation change and a higher sensitivity to different issues that were not important in the past. What's your approach?
Po pierwsze, przepraszam, dziękuję za
First
zaproszenie.
of all, thank you for the invitation, and I am very sorry that I arrived late and I was not able to listen to the first comments that were made. I do not know if I'm a good representative of the Civic Platform Party, and I do not feel like a good representative of that party. During the campaign, together with Ula Zielińska, that was running here in Warsaw, we organized a big press conference, a big meeting on the roof of the University Library here in Warsaw, and it's a green roof, and we presented 10 points regarding the climate change. So if there was one single achievement, content-related and political achievement in that campaign, I think it was the presence of the Greens in our coalition. We've been working together for some time, and I think it had huge impact on our politicians, on the politicians of the Civic Platform, younger and elder ones. And I think if we want to create a new future for Poland, so not just keeping doing what we've been doing, but creating something new, we really need to cooperate with progressive forces, including the Greens, and we need to take it seriously, because we are afraid of talking about the coal. The Greens are not. We are afraid of talking about old cars in Poland. They are not. So we are too fearful to address certain topics that are very much future related, and we need support from the Greens in this regard. So this is one point. Another point is, I believe, well, this is something that refers not just to Poland, it refers to the European situation, I'd say. As Wawrzyniec said, that you could describe the result of the elections as a triumph of democracy. However, if you look at the balances between the different political groups in the European Parliament, where the distribution of power is not very pessimistic, but we do have a significant rise of the populist movements, and we don't know what the sessions of the European Parliament will be like now that we have these populists in the Parliament. And I think that they will be trying to disturb us as much as possible. This is what I think this will look like. And we could have this result that the populists will be even more successful in the general elections coming in different European countries, and this will impact the distribution of power in the European Council, because the European Parliament, this is one thing, but we also have the European Council, and this body is under the influence of the governing parties in different member states of the European Union. And even today we can see that the EPP wants Manfred Weber to become the leader of the Commission, now that we have about 10 parties where EPP has the power, but the Liberals and the Socialists have more power, and now Timmermans could be a candidate as well, but this will create a lot of political tension, of course, and Minister Emilewicz should now be a candidate for the Commissioner of Energy. This could be a deal between Poland and the European Union, because we would have a commissioner dealing with energy. So this could make the approach of Poland a little bit milder in other issues. So this is like a compromise. But Wawrzyniec was saying that there is more fear than hope, and the Liberals, the Greens have more power, and yet you focus on the damage that the populists could cause in the future. And I think this is related to how they impact our imagination. Well, of course, but we also have some experience with them. They do not have the majority, but they will try to use the presence that they have to disturb us as much as possible. They will be like brakes, stopping all our efforts of progressive politics. And we made this experiment in Poland. We had this European coalition, including Socialists, the Greens, Christian Democrats. Unfortunately, we just created this coalition, but did not really develop a good strategy for the campaign to have some added value because of this wide composition of our coalition. But what this could be like in the European Parliament, if we had such a coalition, maybe it will turn out that such a coalition would be possible in the European Parliament in difficult times, in difficult situations. So like a wide coalition, including the Greens and the Socialists and the Christian Democrats and the Liberals. Right now we are discussing the candidates for the leaders of the European institution. But I would like to ask you about the trends. So this would regard the expectations of the voters, their imagination, their needs. What would be your evaluation of the performance of your own party, of your own fraction, as regards these pan-European trends? I think the support for your party is going down and it's not going up, and there is a lot of pressure on the civic platform and the EPP that they need to rethink certain things. Do you feel in a similar way? Yes, I've been feeling so for a long time. So I have seen this need that we need to rethink many things, and I talked about it before the elections. The EPP needs to win the battle with Orban, because the presence of Orban itself will create a lot of tension and a lot of conflicts. And the populists, the nationalists will feel that they have a strong leader. Salvini and Orban are very powerful leaders in the countries of origin. On the other side, we have Timmermans as a popular leader. Another person is Terry Rentke, for example, in the European Parliament. Maybe not as popular as Timmermans, but definitely on the rise. And on the other side, we do not have that many clear leaders, and we have a crisis with regard to leadership. And now different issues like the ecology, the climate change. I can remember a conversation with Peter Liesens, a Christian Democrat from Germany,
bardzo
And he was
mocno włączony w pracę Komisji
involved
Środowiska w Parlamencie Europejskim.
in the works of
Jest
the
dalej członkiem
Environment
Parlamentu.
Committee in the European Parliament. He's
ponieważ
still
ja
a
deklarowałem
member of the
przed wyborami,
Parliament,
że
and
być
I
może
declared
chciałbym
before the
pójść
elections
do
that
Komisji
I
Envi, do Komisji
would
Środowiskowej.
like to
Więc
join
mieliśmy
this
kilka
Environment
pomysłów na to,
Committee.
jak
So we
trochę
talked
przeorać
about
umysły
different ideas on how to change the minds of the EPP so that we could be more open as regards environmental issues. I don't know if we will be successful, but we definitely should make a lot of pressure in this regard. Another thing, but that's just the democracy itself. This is something we've already talked about today, and I think this is an important issue right now. I think it will remain an important issue in the new European Parliament, because all the forces will be talking about it with even more power. Those who have understood how important it is to fight for the rule of law, they will know they cannot give in, and those who have learned that violating these rules of law can be beneficial for them, they will keep doing so. So we will once again have a great battle for democracy in the European Parliament. But you could also say, if you want to reach your environmental goals, make a huge progress, not a small one like it has been the case so far, this will, of course, cause conflicts and tension. Another conflict could be the migration, the refugees, because this is once again an issue, a problem that we did not manage to solve in the last European Parliament. So I think this will stay as a big problem, and it's very important what countries, what member states will get involved to make the solutions rational and good for the future. Another important thing is something that is very often neglected. These are new technologies. We do not talk about them enough. These are important tools, and I think, well, now talking about artificial intelligence, for example, about devices that can learn themselves, we are at a crossroads. We will need to see whether the human beings will be able to control the machines, or maybe not. Maybe the machines will control the human beings. And of course, I'm not talking about rejecting the digital revolution, but we would need to include this human perspective in the debate on new technologies, including the protection of consumers, for example. And right now, there is absolutely no member of the European Parliament from Poland that would have any idea of new technologies right now. Maybe some will decide to learn, but right now they do not have that knowledge, they do not have that expertise. And another thing about the digital revolution, we will talk about taxes in this regard, and protecting the national solutions, or maybe adopting harmonized European solutions instead. And another thing that will cause a lot of troubles in the foreseeable future, it will be debate about the budget. Well, the ideas are important, of course, but we need to understand that we need to have a budget. It's a very practical issue. The European Parliament has prepared everything that is possible. We do have legislative proposals on the table, and the Council is saying that this could be decided until the end of the year. I think it will be decided at the beginning of next year. And the question is whether this budget should be bigger than what the Commission has proposed, and this has already been opposed by many countries, or maybe the budget should be smaller, and we'll just start negotiating whether we should cut the spending or maybe not, like the spending in the area of cohesion policies and research and development. The budget of 100 billion euros, and and this growing power of the Greens all over Europe, I think this will make it easier for us to fight for the environmental issues in the European Parliament, and the Greens will be a leader of opinion, I think, as regards the changes for the future. Well, thank you a lot. I would like to give... Well, you'll be able to ask your own questions soon, but let me ask one more question before you can ask questions yourselves. What is going to happen with the European integration? How do you see it? What trends do you see as regards the European integration? Do you think that the European integration will be deepened in some areas or not? Maybe we'll just keep the status quo in the coming 5 years, or maybe this integration will become deepened just in the Eurozone and not outside of it.
Thank you. I think specifically on the question of integration, if we take these elections that have just taken place, there is absolutely no mandate for a kind of deepening of the European project in terms of both what people sort of say they were voting on the basis of, and also in terms of what parties were campaigning on. You know, we counted a very small proportion of parties, you know, even among the centrists, that had a kind of explicit agenda on that front. I think what's really interesting is in our day after surveys, we were asking about the tolerance for different coalitions of parties among voters. And one kind of proxy we were using for that, because that's not really sort of the way that normal people think about the world, you know, whether you want a kind of liberal, green, socialist coalition or whatever. So we were asking about tolerance for leaders. And one of the things that was very interesting was that the kind of the tolerance for Angela Merkel and her party as part of a coalition was much higher even among anti-European voters than the tolerance for Emmanuel Macron, who has a much more explicit pro-European agenda in a way than Merkel does. And you can read that in a number of ways. You know, you can read that as a message about kind of her being a sort of a German at the centre of Europe. You can read that as a kind of an EPP message. But for me, there is also something about her kind of her more reserved approach to the future of the European project than Macron's more ambitious basis on that approach on that front. And you know, I think the one area where you know, you do have some requests from parties for more Europe is Eurozone integration, where you did have an important minority of parties, I think around 30%, campaigning explicitly on that front. And then more European cooperation in existing areas like migration, like climate change and so on. But again, the sort of the what exactly those policies would be are big differences, and that's where I slightly agreed disagreed with the comments of some people about the kind of the power of the nationalists in this new context, because I do feel that there are very significant differences between kind of both the pro and the anti-European camps now, which is why I do expect to see the discussion becoming more kind of file-based and more kind of even more horse trading within the Parliament and within the Council than we've seen up until now, because I genuinely feel in this fragmented environment that's the only way that the project will continue to move forward. But again, and coming back to the initial comments that the speaker to my left made at the beginning about the sort of the importance of democracy, fragmentation isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is harder to make it work over the longer term.
Chciałam pana zapytać, jak to się przekłada wedle pana na pozycję Polski i Polaków? To, że strefa euro może pogłębić
And what's your opinion? How does this translate into the situation of both? Will the status quo be maintained? As Susie said, we'll need a lot of tactical cooperation at the backstage. That's how it is in the European Parliament. Yes, but to a larger extent than so far. Well, when I have a look at national parliaments, this kind of cooperation is much stronger. When you cross the border, well, I cooperated with Socialists, Greens very smoothly in a number of areas, but I think that we need to realize that there is a problem concerning our part of EU, because when we talk about countries which are outside of the Eurozone, which are Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland, in our part of Europe, and I do not think that we are ready to enter the Eurozone, although I remember an informal conversation in the Visegrad group. One of the people said that Hungary and Czech Republic are ready to enter the Eurozone, but that's really complex. I think that when the fear of economic crisis rises, because this crisis is possible, then the question will emerge whether the EU has the right tools to tackle it. And there will be an issue to establish the European Monetary Fund, and if this discussion emerges, then there will be a debate on the participation of all the European Union countries in the Eurozone, because we need to contribute to the fund in order to be able to benefit from the fund in case some crisis situation happens. So I think that if the economic crisis is more severe, then the debate on the participation in the Eurozone will take place. And I think that during the next 6 months, decisions will be taken concerning the heads of European institutions, and it will turn out whether Poland is an active participant of the discussions and the decision-taking process. And a lot will depend on whether Poland will be an active participant or whether it will just passively observe what's going on. And this bargaining about the energy commissioner, as I mentioned, this morning I read that Polish lady might be a candidate for the energy commissioner. And this is a political bargaining. And a lot will depend on the decisions taken in the coming months, and a lot will depend also on the political situation in Poland on the national level. But I think that the distance towards our part of Europe will be bigger and bigger among the traditional states, so EU 28 minus 12. And this will not be easy for us. We lost our chance in the past years because of the government that we had. Eva, what do you think? How do you see these processes? And even, to put it very brutally, how much do you fear that the EU will not survive? Well, I think this won't happen during this term of office of the European Parliament. This will not happen during the next 5 years. As IPCC is telling us, until 2030 we need to make substantial changes, but the effects of climate changes will come a bit later. If we do not do the things that are needed, we will see the consequences. Michał Boni said about the conflict around migration, but migration is very much linked to climate change. If we do not have enough water, if we do not have enough water, people migrate to find their own place in the world, and the debate has been sparked off, and it is very much needed. And I hope that the coalitions which will be established with the Green meetings will facilitate the debate on climate issues, on globalization. We need to be aware of the Paris Agreement. We need to treat trade as a religion, as something that is good irrespective of the conditions, as something that makes our GDP grow. So the mechanism of thinking needs to change, and this requires lots of work. Thanks to our partners with EPP, who will talk to corporations, this changed attitude toward economy, fight for taxes. These efforts have been made by the EPP in the European Parliament, and it was really difficult to talk to the EPP on that matters, tax paradise, and so on and so forth. We need spending on social justice and on climate issues, and I hope that the debate on globalization, relocation, other investments going in other directions, for instance, making people aware of how much energy a washing machine consumes, that's pretty much known, but we do not know such things about the atmosphere, and this should be changed. And some people claimed we would have Europe of two speeds. Well, Europe has always experimented. There have always been groups of countries which experimented. For instance, Benelux countries, Schengen zone. They were going faster in a given direction, trying out certain solutions. The greater effects, climate and environmental effects we have, the greater the loss of biodiversity will be, the more conflicts and chaos we'll have, and the pressure will grow, and the countries where the level of awareness is higher will step up and create certain groups to try out new solutions. We need to make sure that our citizens are aware of the issues, so that our politicians are not afraid of joining these experimental groups. I think it's not only about awareness, but also economic power. So the richer the country, the easier it is for it to join such groups. Yes, but it's all about faith and priorities. We will be able to redirect the political force in the right direction if we have the right attitude. And now, Swawrzyniec Smoczyński, do you think that there are ongoing works on a kind of welfare state in Europe? And Eva Sofin said that the discussion is ongoing on globalization, capitalism, digital challenges, climate affairs. Do you think that this contributes to the discussion on a new European model?
Well, from my experience, I can say the following things. I analyzed the politics in different countries, including some that were very successful, like the New Deal project of Roosevelt or the famous Swedish model. And my conclusion would be, if you realize that there is a model, it happens only later. So something has worked successfully, and then you want to talk about it, and then you come up with the idea that there was a plan in the beginning. However, in the beginning you didn't really realize that it was a model. It was only later that you realized that it was based on a model. So you just need to learn your lessons when you make mistakes, and sometimes these lessons make it possible for you to come up with good ideas, even though it is not model-based in the beginning. So maybe there is a tiny town in Switzerland, or maybe in France, or maybe in Magdalenka here around Warsaw. Maybe there could be a master plan, big being worked on right now? Well, let's be honest, even if there is one, it's very likely not to make it to the mainstream. So it's not really that it looks like this, that you come up with a model and then you implement it. It just happens. And I remember a conversation with Steinmeier. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it was the beginning of the war in Syria, and we had a debate in Berlin, and he was asked by a very ideologist journalist when there would be a breakthrough in the Middle East politics. And Steinmeier, who is an idealist but also a very pragmatic person with a lot of experience with dealing with different conflicts, and he just took his time to think about it, and he said it's actually very successful nowadays in politics if you are able to maintain the status quo. It is not a time now for changing the world dramatically. It is a situation in which we need to try our best to maintain the status quo so that things do not get worse. So I think we should be happy if at the end of the term of the new European Parliament, the European institutions will not be weaker than they are now. This does not mean that we should not have any ambitions. We should have ambitions. However, we should be realistic as well, and we should focus on solving the current problems and preserving what has already been achieved by the previous generations. This is one thing. Another thing, well, it's about the core of politics. The core of politics is not what the political leaders do in the second half of their political careers, like Timmermans or Jean-Claude Juncker. It is important what the voters want and what the awareness is. You were talking about ecology. I have 3 kids. My eldest daughter is 16 years old, and she is an activist in this youth strike for the climate. So she organizes strikes in Warsaw, and she meets even younger children and educates them about the climate change. And she's going to Aachen next week to join a demonstration. It will be a pan-European demonstration against the construction of a new nuclear power plant in Germany. So think about it, that a Polish girl is going to participate in a demonstration in Germany. And of course, the awareness in Germany is much higher than in Poland with regards to environmental issues. So, if we do have a pan-European topic, you can see that people do get in touch across borders, like these young people. And on the one hand, we have the national populists, and on the other hand, we have the so-called ecologists, people who are very radical as well, and they are just focused on the climate challenge, climate crisis, and nothing else. And if we can influence the environmental issues, this could lead to the foundation of a new political force in the European Union that would go across borders. And something that could surprise us, well, this is an economic crisis. If we have an economic crisis, this could bring about huge changes in both European politics and in both European and Polish politics. So if there is an economic crisis, this will really shake us. I hope this will not happen, but there is a certain risk that the countries here in Eastern and Central Europe who are under this influence of authoritarian politics, they could turn out to be new countries in European economics that just believe that they can cope on themselves because the economy has been doing well so far, but they will face a crisis in which they will need the help of Western European countries, and they will need this European solidarity, which they think now does not exist. So this could be then the reason for deepening the European integration once again. And I think the audience could have questions now, so let's collect maybe 3, maybe 4 questions, and then we could have a second round of answers.
Bardzo dziękuję za niezwykle ciekawą dyskusję, która pokazuje, że znajdujemy
Thank you
się w
so
zupełnie
much
innym
for
momencie
very
niż jeszcze
interesting
niedawno. Partia
debate,
Zielonych
which makes us
ogromny
realize
sukces
we are in a
gratuluję.
totally different realities than we used to be, and I would like to congratulate cordially to the Greens Party. Let me refer to a couple of things that were mentioned by our panelists. We are afraid, the world is afraid.
W okresie rewolucji oczywiście nie wiemy. To jest tak jak
We are living at
patrzymy w
times
lustro
of a
i nie widzimy
revolution
zmiany,
which
które zachodzą
we
w naszych twarzach.
are not
Ale tak jak z rewolucją
realizing.
przemysłową, za jakiś czas historycy to
We will
określą i
see
powiedzą, tak, to
this
była rewolucja,
revolution
która
in a
dokonuje się w
couple
tej
of
chwili na naszych
years.
oczach.
That's how it
Znaczy, świat będzie
happens. The
inny
same
i ludzie
was
się
the
tego
case with the Industrial
Ja myślę,
Revolution,
że ta
and
linia
people
podziału,
are
o której
afraid
państwo
of
mówili,
that.
populiści,
And
moim
this
zdaniem populiści
line of
przestaną
division
wpisywać
that you
zjawiska,
talked about, where
polityczne,
populists
które w tej chwili
stop
się
to
pojawiają na scenie,
describe
nie tylko Europy, ale
political
świata.
phenomena
To-
present in
to dwa
Europe
rodzaje
and
myślenia
in
o
the
tym, jak
world.
poradzić
And
sobie z tym
these two
kryzysem
groups are
strachu,
two ways of
zarządzania
thinking
Jedna wizja
concerning
to
this
ta
fear,
wizja
two ways of managing
nacjonalistyczna,
the fear.
zamknięcia
One of these
federalnie
vision
rzecz
is the
biorąc.
nationalist
Czyli
vision
odwrócenie
to
uwagi społeczeństw małych
divert
grup.
attention of
Przypomnij im, że rodzina
communities,
jest
small
zagrożona,
groups
że
from
mamy być
important
może
groups,
konflikt militarny, to jest
from
najbardziej
important problems,
niebezpieczne.
reminding
Tak naprawdę
them
to jest
of the
największa,
value of
przepraszam,
family,
językiem młodzieżowym mówiąc, ściema, jaka istnieje. Nie grozi nam
drawing
konflikt
their attention to
klasycznie
issues
militarny,
such as
a
military
zbroimy się tak,
conflicts,
jakbyśmy po prostu
which are not
byli za chwilę
real.
mieli mieć wojnę po prostu.
We are
Żadne
behaving in a way that
rozwiąże żadnego z tych
suggests
problemów,
that an
państwo
armed
mówili.
conflict is
Te
ahead of
rzeczywiste
us,
problemy,
which is not
to jest
true.
problem, czy
The real
świat
problems that we
pozostanie,
are
w tym
facing
Europa i-
is whether the world and
cywilizacja
Europe and
euroatlantycka
civilization,
pozostanie
Euro-Atlantic
otwarta, czy nie.
civilization will
A więc nacjonaliści
remain
czy
open or
tradycjonaliści
not.
kontra,
So nationalists,
uniwersaliści de
conservatists,
facto, którzy rozumieją, że
versus
ten świat, gdziekolwiek by się nie
universalists
działo, dotyczy
who
również nas, bo
realize
jest
that
globalizacja jest już faktem.
the changes are there
I
all over
w
the
tym
world
kontekście,
because of globalization.
wydaje się, że to właśnie
And
Partia
against
Zielonych
that backdrop,
ma najlepszy
it
pakiet. Nie
seems
mówię dlatego, że
that
to jest,
the Green Party,
Fundacja Bella i
and
to
I'm
jest
not saying
kurtuazja.
this because this
Jeżeli
event
tylko
is
ten projekt
co-organized
będzie
by the
poszerzony
Heinrich Böll
poza kwestie,
Foundation. No, but I think
kwestie
that the Greens are well equipped
środowiska.
to handle all those
o kwestie
problems.
społeczne, bo
We
musimy
need to take
myśleć
account
o
of
społeczeństwie
environmental
zupełnie w nowych
issues.
kategoriach,
We
ale
need
również i
to
o polityce.
take a different
Tradycyjna
perspective
polityka już się,
on
proszę
the
państwa, skończyła.
societies.
Trzeba
The
wejść, jak
traditional
mówią Amerykanie,
politics
out of the
is
box.
over. We need to think out of the box.
skonfrontować się z
We need to
obywatelem na
confront
ulicy.
with
Iść
citizens
do tych
in
młodych
the
ludzi.
street. We need to approach
O mojej
young
generacji już było
people.
powiedziane, że powinniśmy się zamknąć. Za chwilę to uczynię, ale zanim to zrobię,
Old
to
guys
mogę
should shut
powiedzieć
down.
tylko tyle,
I'll do
że-
that in a
że-
second. But
że
before
Partia
I do
Ludowa,
that, let me tell you
do której już
that
coraz większy
People's
dystans ma
Party,
Michał Boni.
Michał Boni is very much distanced
Okay.
towards that party.
Ale Partia Ludowa, która
But
sięga w kalkulacji
the EPP
politycznej do spotkań i układania się tutaj z Mateuszem Morawieckim czy z Orbanem,
Has old
mówi bardzo wiele.
traditions.
Koniec będzie taki, jak to miało miejsce w Hiszpanii.
But
a
we
tam
need
śledzę
different kinds of
wydarzenia.
politics. I'm
Partido
following the
Popular
situation
praktycznie się
in
rozpadło na
Spain.
Vox i
Partido Popular
ponieważ
split
część
into
radykalnie nacjonalistyczna
different
i prawicowa
groupings
po prostu nie
because
zdzierżyło
the
tej partii
traditionalist,
środka.
conservative
Te partie
groupings
mają,
hated
prawie że zakończyło. To
the
jest ten
centrist
klasyczny
part
mainstream.
of the
Będziemy
group.
mieli do czynienia zupełnie z
And
nowym
this is
modelem.
a very
I
common
Partia Zielonych
trend.
jest
We
jedną
will
z tych
have a
chyba
totally
z tych
different
grup,
model, and the Green Party is
społeczno-politycznych
one
ruchów,
of the
który jest w stanie
political
sięgnąć do
and
wyobraźni
social
umysłowości
groups that
młodej
are
generacji.
able to
Pytanie moje
reach
jest, co wyjdzie z tej układanki
the
Martina Webera,
awareness
która jeszcze, że mówiąc bardzo
and
przeraża,
attract
bo to tak
young
jakby
people.
Europejska Partia Ludowa przestała myśleć o wartościach,
And
które dla nas w
It
Polsce
seems
są
that
tak ważne,
the EPP
że
with
może nie jest
Martin
ważna już
Weber
praworządność,
stops
że może
to think
nie trzeba
about the
myśleć
values that are
o tym,
important
że
to us.
za wszystkie te 300, 500 plus, ile by to nie było, jest pewien koszt. Ten koszt
We
nasze
need to
właśnie ograniczenie
realize
wolności.
that each time
Nic
we get
nie ma za darmo i ludziom
money
młodym trzeba to
from the
powiedzieć.
government,
Coś zostaje
we
im,
need
jest
to
im jednocześnie
give
odbierane
something in
za
exchange,
każde 100
and this
złotych,
might
które
be
dostają
our
do tego,
freedom.
żeby wydać w
Young
supermarkecie.
people need to
Dziękuję bardzo.
realize that for each 100 zloty they get, or each 500 zloty they get, they need to pay 100 zloty more. My question,
nawiązując troszeczkę do tego, co Mówił Pan o technologii, o rozwoju technologicznym.
Is addressed at Michał Boni. You talked about technological revolution. We are all well aware of the fact that digital solutions make our life easier, but they also deepen social inequalities. So my question is, what can we do so that the AI development and in general development of digital solutions helps to bridge the gap between wealthy ones and poor ones? One more question at the back, if I'm correct.
Many thanks, and many thanks first for the range of really interesting insights overall. I have two questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, I'm interested in the geographic shifts across the EU, and particularly your reflection, Susie, that the EPP in particular has seen, a shift in dominance to maybe Central Europe. And I was wondering what impact, maybe this is also a question to the wider panel in that sense, is what impact do you potentially see in terms of that shift on the current Polish government's thinking as regards alliances, particularly given its desire to ensure it, plays a strong role within the European Parliament. And then my second question is really more, it's directed at Virginia in terms of the, I suppose, the shift in terms of outcomes for the autumn. You mentioned the fact that prior to the election you would have thought, you were 80-20 in favour, in support of essentially peace actually winning, whereas now that has shifted maybe to a 50-50 position. And I'm wondering, what is it, do you believe, that has actually brought about that shift in particular, particularly because you then went on to refer about the power instruments that are actually in the hands of peace, and my sense would have been that those power instruments will continue to be used. So is there something else that's at play there?
Tak, jeszcze jeden. Tak.
Jan Truszczyński, ponieważ jestem jeszcze starszy.
Jan Truszczyński, I'm even older than Ambassador Schnaps.
Tym, co on powiedział,
and I allowed myself to ask a question as well, mostly to Mr. Boni. Tomorrow, four political groups, EPP, Socialists, the Greens and ALDE, will start to talk about things that are related to establishing a common ground, a common position that could be presented to the European Commission, and they will also try, hopefully, to create a common platform which will make it very likely that we'll have a European mainstream dominating in terms of numbers in the European Parliament, but we'll also be able to develop some impulses to tackle problems in the next 5 years. What do you think the chances are for those four political groups to create a common platform? Thank you so much. The very last question.
Jak mogę, tak najkrócej.
As briefly as possible. Ewa Hołuszko. My comment is as follows. We are talking about European Parliament, European institutions. The last elections showed that some current countries support Europe, and the part of Europe that we are in perceives the European Parliament as something from a different planet. We were talking about our country only. We should put more emphasis on the European dimension. Parliamentary elections in Poland are due in autumn, and I think that also the Council will depend on the outcomes of the elections. What do you think?
żeby jednak te siły
What can we
prodemokratyczne
do so that
wygrały?
pro-democratic
Dotychczasowe
forces
wybory były
are successful?
takie, że z jednej
Because so
strony
far
były PiS, który miał program, tak, populistyczny, ale to
we've had
zrobimy, to zrobimy,
peace
a z
with a
drugiej to była
populist program,
pospolite ruszenie,
and on the
które nie
other
miało żadnego
hand,
programu,
we had
tylko
some,
antyPiS.
well,
To przegrywa wreszcie.
so to speak, grassroots
Jak te
movements
siły
saying
proeuropejskie
just do
zjednoczą-
anything
Bardzo dziękuję.
to
Zaczęłabym
oppose
od,
peace, how to unite
Hawoniego.
the political forces. I'd
Może
like to
pytanie
start
pana
with
ambasadora.
Michał
Jakie są
Boni.
szanse na
Could you
powstanie
answer the
tego,
question asked by the
proeuropejskiego
ambassador?
mainstreamu
What do you
EPL,
think the chances are to
socjaldemokraci,
create
zieloni,
this mainstream platform?
Pytania po pierwsze.
Thank you very much for the questions. That's
Samo to, że
the
odbywa się
first thing.
spotkanie,
And then
ma
let
już
me
duże
tell you
znaczenie.
that
Przepraszam, bo to tak ostrożnie brzmi. Tak?
the very fact that the
Ale
meeting
ja
is
postawiłem
taking
taką
place
tezę, czy
is
uda się
important.
powtórzyć w Parlamencie Europejskim ten pomysł dotyczący koalicji europejskiej, który zaistniał w Polsce, tylko że w Polsce
Will it be
zaistniał
possible to
instytucjonalnie
do
bez
in the
dalszego
European Parliament what was done
programowego
in
ciągu.
Poland when the European
Jeśli te
coalition was
spotkania się
created
zaczną,
to take part in the
I
election?
myślę, jeśli pojawią się
So,
pierwsze kłopoty w najbliższym czasie, po
when the
pierwszej Radzie,
first issues
gdy nie
and
będzie jasne,
problems
jaki będzie układ między
arise,
państwami, jeśli
when
chodzi o
it's
wybór
not clear
szefa Komisji
as
Europejskiej,
to
jeśli się
how
okaże,
to
że nie jest tak
elect
prosto wybrać
president
szefa
of
parlamentu i tak dalej, to
Commission,
moim zdaniem
when it turns out that it's
trudności,
not
które
that
się pojawią
easy
na
to
najbliższych
elect
2-3 miesiącach na
president
tej mapie politycznej
of the
europejskiej,
Parliament,
nie
then
zamkną te możliwości rozmowy, tylko je szerzej otworzą. Więc mam
there
tutaj
will be
taki mały
even
element
more
optymizmu.
debate
Ale
between
to
the
będzie
groups.
bardzo trudna
I'm
A
rozmowa.
co dalej z EPL-em?
Quite
Dobra, ja mam
optimistic.
napisane wszystkie pytania, także
Okay, and what about
postaram się
EPP?
odpowiedzieć, tak?
Yes,
Pan ambasador
that's
mówił o tym
something I'll
zarządzaniu strachem,
refer to.
jeśli mogę
The
jedno
ambassador
zdanie
talked about
byłoby
managing
dobrze,
fear. Let
gdybyśmy
me refer to
szerzej
that as well.
analizowali przyczyny
I
strachu.
think we should
Bo
analyze
część
the
tego
roots
strachu
of
ma
the
realne
fear
podstawy,
from a
część tego
broader
strachu jest
perspective. Some of
wykreowana,
that fear
oparta o
has
dezinformacje, fake newsy i tak dalej. O stereotypy, tak, które są
realistic
budowane.
roots,
I moim
but
zdaniem,
some of
dopóki sobie z tym nie
it
damy
is
rady,
created
dopóki na
because of some
przykład w
fake
środowiskach
news,
centrowych
and we need to tackle
będziemy
it.
ulegali presji
We
stereotypów
cannot succumb
dotyczących
to the
LGBTI.
pressure regarding
tak,
stereotypes
Umownie środowisk
concerning
ulega
LGBT.
stereotypom
Some of
tradycyjnym myślenie 30-40
the
lat do
nationalist
tyłu.
right-wing
Niektórzy
movements in
PSL
Poland
mówi,
succumb to
boimy
the
się i
pressure
nie
of
chcemy
thinking that
ideologicznej
we
wojny
are
z Kościołem.
afraid of
To nie o
LGBT
żadną ideologiczną wojnę z
and they do
Kościołem
not
chodzi,
want
tylko
to
o prawa
enter
człowieka.
an ideological
powiedzieć,
fight
że nie ma wolności bez
with the
równości.
church in
Tyle,
Poland.
tak?
And
Bo
it's not
przecież
about
tej
an
nowej
ideological
perspektywie myślowej, tak?
fight with the
Więc,
church.
ta
It's
odwaga w
about
myśleniu jest
equal
tutaj
rights
potrzebna.
for everyone. So we
Czy
need to
EPL
be
będzie,
brave in our thinking. Will the EPP
odważniejszy w sensie...
be braver, or will
co do tego
it
nie mam,
collapse? No,
znaczy,
no,
nie
I
uważam,
don't
żeby
think
EPL
that
się rozpadł.
the EPP will
Może się
collapse.
natomiast
No,
okazać,
but
że
I think it
nastąpią
might
różne,
turn out there
dekompozycje.
will be some decomposition.
Nikt nie wie do końca,
No one knows
jaką
for
siłę
sure
oddziaływania w Parlamencie Europejskim może mieć
what's the
Macron.
strength
Jeśli zdecyduje się na pewne
of
ruchy,
Macron in the
które
European
polegałyby
Parliament
na tym,
if
że
he
nie tylko
decides to
weźmie
take some
liberałów,
steps
ale weźmie
and take
część
not only
socjalistów
liberals
i
but
część
also some
osób od,
socialists and
chatyków
also
również,
some
tak?
Christian Democrats.
Françoise Grossetête, ważna posłanka
So Grossetête,
EPL-u,
an
która w
important
trakcie kampanii
MEP
do Parlamentu
from the
Europejskiego
European
jasno
People's
poparła
Party
Macrona. Tak? Jak się
supported
z nią
very
dzisiaj
clearly
rozmawia,
Macron
to widać, że
during
ona
the
będzie
run-up
szukała
to the
swojego nowego
elections,
miejsca.
and
Więc toczy się,
we can see
nie sądzę,
clearly
żeby
that she
EPL
will
się
be
rozpadł.
looking for a new
Natomiast
place
jest dla
for
mnie
herself.
zagadką
I do not
to,
think
jak
that the
zbuduje swoją
EPP will
pozycję w
collapse, but the
parlamencie
question
Macron,
is
bo nie
what
odpuści,
the position
tak? Myślę,
of Macron
będzie
will
szukał
be in the
jakiegoś
European Parliament.
sposobu.
I think he will not give up.
Co
He
do
will
Orbana,
try to
myślę, że
find
jest
a way
potrzebna
to
jednoznaczność, a
become
nie takie
powerful in
punktatorstwo
the
po obu stronach, bo to on
Macron,
też
and
jest
I think that
punktatorem,
we
tak?
need to
On się
be
zastanawia, co bardziej
more
uzyska jaką siłę,
decisive
tak?
when it
możliwych
comes
wpływów,
to
jeśli
Orban.
zostanie albo odejdzie. Tak?
We
Więc,
need to take
moim
a
zdaniem
more
to
decisive
powinno być
steps.
przecięte. Moje zdanie powinno być przecięte,
We
jasno
need
zdefiniowane,
to
nie mieści
take
się tak? w obozie demokratycznym
action.
do trzeba
There's no place for him
Bardzo
in
ważne
the
pytanie
democratic
dotyczące
camp.
tych nierówności
Very important
świata
question about inequalities
technologii.
related
Są trzy
to the
wymiary.
world of
Pierwsza to
technologies.
jest
There are three
dostęp do
dimensions.
sieci.
The first
to
one
jest
is
coś,
access
co
to the web.
różnicuje, tak?
That's something that makes a
Jak ja słyszę
difference.
różne dyskusje w Polsce o
I can hear
wprowadzaniu
lots of
5G
discussions in
i o
Poland
tym po
about the
kolei, jak do
introduction of
którego giga, to może
5G.
zbyt fachowe jest, będzie się dochodziło, to jest dla
And
mnie
how
jasne, że
all
znowu
the
wieś,
gigabytes
tak,
will
te
be,
koncepcja, które
approached.
na dzisiaj są, zostanie z boku, tak? Znaczy, że nie będzie objęta tą możliwością korzystania z
This
ultraszybkiego internetu.
suggests
Wielki
that
problem
not
dla
all of
Unii
us will
i
be able
myślę, że
to use the
właśnie
benefits,
wprowadzanie
to
5G
profit
pokaże,
from the benefits
czy
of
wszyscy będą
broadband,
objęci w równy
fast
sposób.
internet.
Drugi
And this
element
will be an
to jest
important
edukacja
issue. All
dla
the citizens
wszystkich,
should be
i
covered
wiekowo,
by
bo to i
access
dzieci,
to
ale i
broadband
starsi,
internet.
i ze
Another
wszystkich,
thing is
możliwych,
education
grup
for all
społecznych,
people at all ages,
dotycząca,
from all social
takiej
groups regarding
właśnie źle powiedziane umiejętności cyfrowych, bo
digital
powiedziałbym umiejętności,
skills,
kompetencji i postaw szerzej.
competences,
Znaczy, my musimy się nauczyć żyć
attitudes,
w tym
because
nowym
these are not
świecie
only
ludzi,
skills. We
cyfrowej,
need
bo to
to
nie chodzi o proste
learn how to
umiejętności
live in
posługiwania
this
się
new
komputerem,
world.
tak?
It's
Tylko
not
chodzi o
only about
rozumienie tego
learning
nowego
how to
świata,
use
tak, żeby móc
computer, it's
przyjąć
about understanding how this world functions. There are lots of debates on how the AI will function, how the robots will function, and we need to be able to cooperate with the robots. We need to learn not to be afraid of them. So access to education. And the third dimension is everything that's linked to the so-called human approach, also based on fundamental rights, privacy, feeling of security, and the ethical dimension. Because I think that those three dimensions, well, in case of new technologies, inequalities are created in a bit different way. In the past, it was about the question whether someone can afford to buy a computer or a smartphone. Now the situation is different. The source of inequalities is these three dimensions, not the money. So, access to broadband internet, first thing. The second thing, the ability to understand how digital world functions. And third thing is exclusion, which results from the fact that the ethical privacy dimension is not taken into account. I need to stop you. Okay, you're stopping me all the time. Okay, sorry, but I'd like to give the floor to Eva Sufin. Please refer to what's most important to you.
So I would like to make 3 points, and I think they're very important. So first of all, I would like to refer to technology once again, and indeed, this issue is crucial. Now that we have this debate about different threats regarding the climate change and the environment, it is a natural way to look for a technological answer and to believe that the technology will solve this problem as such. And I think that we need some reservation and we need some proper analysis, and that's the contribution that the Greens make. In the treaty, we have this a rule that we need to be cautious. And what does it mean? If we have a technology that may create serious threats for people, for their lives, for their health, we should be cautious. We should approach it with a reservation, even if we do not have scientific evidence yet that these threats will exist. And let me give you one example. The 5G technology, which should be implemented in Poland and the European Union, we will need over 100,000 antennas in Poland, and no analysis have been made with regard to electromagnetic pollution resulting from those antennas and how to counteract those threats.
Dobrze, ale tu chodzi o sam fakt, że
So
trzeba
these
tę
are
dyskusję
facts.
odbyć.
We need
Nie
to
można
have this
jej,
discussion.
nie
We
można jej
need to
zamiatać
have
pod
this
dywan. Ja wiem, że
debate.
na przykład
You cannot pretend it does not exist. I know that in France, the Christian Democrats introduced launched a very important debate about this electromagnetic pollution, and they are working on a new law to regulate where such antennas can be installed and where they should not be installed. And this debate is not held in this country at all. Well, we do not need this debate, of course, but Poland, Bulgaria, Lithuania and Italy are the countries that have provisions in this regard that were introduced in the 70s. Well, so much time has passed, and right now we cannot install a small antenna on news agents because we have these old provisions from the 70s that regulate these issues, and they are not up to date at all. So we have this yes or no approach in Poland, and we need a reasonable debate and not this yes or no approach. This debate should be deepened, and social inequalities, well, all these threats, social and ecological threats, they are interrelated. These are not two different sides. They go together, and the events, the movement of the Yellow Vests has shown how progressive politics should not be made. It was a tax that was introduced by Macron, and it just disturbed the balance with regard to social inequalities, and it shows that we need to analyze these issues together, social and ecological problems and solutions, and the role of active democracy, of direct democracy. The European Union needs to be closer to its citizens, and this European initiative is an example of showing that you care about your citizens, but actually you do not. We have had 70 citizens' initiatives in the European Union, 4 fulfilled all the conditions, but still, even though there was a debate in the European Parliament, no real legislation followed. So we need to find other instruments, other tools to make citizens closer to the decision-making process. And now, Mr. Smoczyński, why did you say that it used to be 80-20 and it is now 50-50 with regard to this competition between PiS and the European coalition? I think the best way to involve the citizens is to answer the questions that have been asked by the audience and not talk about other things that were not addressed by the audience. Well, I am happy that we have a sex balance here to men and to women. This is already good, but now to answer your question, this 80-20 balance, this was in January 2019, before the Srebrna scandal happened and before the opposition was united within the European coalition. It looked like there was absolutely no internal crisis in the PiS party that could pose a threat. And that happened later because we had this great scandal, Srebrna scandal, with regard to this skyscraper that was supposed to be built by Kaczynski. So right now I'm saying 50-50. Why? PiS used all its resources to mobilize the people. The European coalition did get united, but it still does not have a common program, a common manifesto. And the European elections now show where they should focus on mobilizing the voters. We cannot hope that people will vote for the European coalition if the European coalition does not have a real good program program manifesto for what should be done after the general elections. And now, what is missing right now in the European coalition? I think 3 years have been wasted because there was absolutely no response to the discourse that was set by the governing party. There was this whole debate where Poland stays 30 years after the transformation, the economic and political transformation. PiS launched a real debate about the problems that people have. It's also a question of whether or not we feel we are a community, economic and political community in Poland, or maybe we're atomized as a society. There are also threats with regard to identity, physical security. People feel there might be an economic crisis coming soon because the economy has been on a rise for 25 years, so it's like normal for the economy to go up and then to go down for some time. So people feel like this going down could happen now. And the politicians need to answer these fears. They should deliver answers to those questions. And right now this is not happening because the politicians of the European coalition are not close to the people, and they just don't feel these issues people identify. And I cannot create a political program for the European coalition now. I think it will take a lot of time. It's not an easy task. And now, to sum up, Susie Dennison, could you please sum up our debate, because you will be the last speaker, and we're asked this question about the geographical shift in the EPP, like the EPP moving towards the east, and what could be the consequences for the PiS party in Poland?
Thank you very much. I think a bit difficult to sum up such a broad discussion, but one quick reflection on the last round of questions that we've had in the discussion. For me, one of the most interesting things about the Green Wave is not just about how the Green parties deal with that, and there, just to clarify, I do agree that we've seen important increases in a whole range of countries. The point I was simply trying to make is in the political group, it will still be the Germans, the French and the UK until Brexit that dominate. But absolutely that phenomenon is important. But I think the other aspect of the Green Wave, which we haven't really touched on today, is the extent to which climate change is also a driver for voters of mainstream parties. And I think it's very likely, and today's discussion has partly kind of reflected that we're going to see an impact on the discussion of other parties, a bit in the way that we've seen sort of the migration debate from the far right infiltrate the mainstream. I think that climate will become a really important topic for finding common ground and coalitions between the different groups. It's not going to be easy, as we've seen, but I think it is an important challenge. Then secondly, very directly on the impact of the geographical shifts within the political groups, and specifically the EPP. For me, firstly, I think that although PiS had a very strong result in these elections here in Poland, I think that to some extent we did see prior to the elections a loss of power for the kind of PiS vision within the EPP group, with not insignificant backtracking on sort of certain domestic issues as a result of pressure from the European level. So I think that although PiS may feel sort of emboldened domestically in these elections, that doesn't necessarily read through into them feeling sort of emboldened at European level to define the vision of the family going forward. I think one of the critical factors in terms of their influence within the EPP will be the extent, sort of how these leadership discussions play out, how much political capital is used by the EPP on trying to kind of force Weber through after elections where, you know, to my reading, there really isn't a mandate for that. I think if EPP do want to kind of force their Spitzenkandidat through the process, then there's going to have to be kind of real solidarity within the group, and achieving that will probably mean, you know, kind of some deals being done within the party. So I think that would be a really bad move, because I agree with whichever of the other speakers it was that said that the most dangerous thing in this next mandate for the Parliament will be more of the same. kind of a status quo parliament, and I think that that kind of behaviour and you know, the focus that we're seeing from the other big political groups too on the kind of Spitzenkandidat process or not is quite dangerous in that sense, because it does look like a kind of collective sigh of relief. Okay, the elections are over, let's go back to the way that we did things before. So yeah, I think that will matter. I think the second thing that will matter a lot is what happens with Fidesz. And you know, I think there is. It is possible to imagine that Orbán, who also had a strong result, although not as strong as one might have anticipated, given his kind of control of media and so on around the elections, he may decide that he doesn't kind of have enough power within the EPP, and he might have a more natural home sort of outside in a group like the ECR. That may then have an impact on PiS thinking about sort of how much power they've got within the EPP and whether they would be more comfortable elsewhere. So I think there is kind of some positioning that will play out as well as this kind of geographical shift. But, you know, that's what I kind of see the next kind of few months as being for kind of all the political groups and then the council more broadly sort of learning to live with these new realities and changes. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting time over the next few months, not just in terms of the parties, but also in terms of the kind of the agenda that emerges out of this and the extent to which that really reflects what people think they voted for.
Dziękuję. Thank you very much. Dziękuję Państwu bardzo.
Thank you very
Dziękuję
much.
za cierpliwość,
Thank you for your patience.
Również. A Państwu dziękuję bardzo
And
za
thank you for your active participation in the debate. Thank you very much.